A bit about innovation today. I'm going to show you an innovative project that I just finished, which has an element of workplace and learning to it. And we used a particular framework to put the team together and to manage the team that worked on the project. The main thing I want to focus on, though, is what I'm starting to call collective intelligence. And that's the kind of the glue of getting people working together better. How do you do that? How do you measure that? How do you know when you've reached an objective? And very often when companies set targets, they set objectives, they're stretch targets. And that usually means that the workforce isn't really up to it. And you've got to know where's the gap and how am I going to fill it. We'll talk a bit about a definition of innovation. We'll talk about competitive advantage. And then this notion of collective social intelligence as well. And then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. So the first thing I need somebody to do is tell me, so I've been sort of shuffling these cards all day, and I don't spend much time in Vegas, but I'm just going to start throwing cards out and somebody tell me when to stop. You tell me when to stop. Okay, I've got one that says creativity and innovation. Who's got creativity and innovation? If you can't find it, then yours, look on the seat next to you if there's a blank one. You do. You're the lucky winner. You get to come up here. The first thing I want to do is I want everybody to think about the word innovation and write down a definition of what you think innovation is, and I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to do that. And while they're doing that, your definition of innovation is going to become very public, so you need to write down what you think innovation is.
What we've actually done is mapped over 10,000 data points, and those 10,000 points represent universities, cooperative research centers, individual and industry research projects, centers of excellence, individual ARC discovery projects, and linkage projects. And the next step now is to look at, are there relationships being formed around things that are similar, or are there relationships being formed around things that are complementary? And so really the next step is to get much better at making sure that we help people make those connections. Each data point represents a company or a person, and then it's the data points around a company or a person that start to matter. So what we want to do is manage the value in those relationships rather than always just worrying about what those things are costing.
On the commercial side to foster more international trade. So Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the things you've been involved in that have enhanced relations between Australia and the Latin American region?
Yeah, well, thank you. So one of the things I found interesting about those examples is, well, how do you decide if you have a sort of working with a relatively small country like Australia from maybe what might be considered a small funding base? How do you decide what to do? And if you don't know what to do, how do you get involved in doing something that will tell you whether or not there's value in having a relationship between a Latin American company and Australia? So one of the areas I've been lucky to work in is research and development. And Australia, for instance, as with many Latin American countries, have a reasonable R&D tax incentive. We heard this morning that investors don't particularly want to hear about R&D tax incentives, but actually they're a good way of developing relationships. One of the things you can do in Australia is spend money in another country doing R&D as one part of, say, exporting something to that market. So that's a very specific way of going about developing a new business relationship. And a really good example of that is I'm working right now with a Brazilian entrepreneur who runs a agribusiness fund from New York and has a property in Australia that he's developing some new farming practices on under an R&D type project. When he's ready to scale that R&D, the first place he wants to take it to is Brazil. And the reason is, other than the fact that he is Brazilian, the reason is he's been able to develop the R&D in a country that has a similar climate, both in terms of the economic climate as well as things like the weather. And Brazil is open to new ideas. So this particular idea is relating to how you feed cows. And in order for him to sell this into the U.S., he'd have to change the feedlot industry in America, and that's just not going to happen in the U.S. So Brazil is more open to new ideas for one reason or another. I don't have all the reasons in my head. But my point is that developing a relationship with Australia is something that's allowing him to market and commercialize something in Brazil. So that's one way. And one thing that I find interesting is if I look at the types of projects that Australian companies are spending money on in terms of R&D in other countries, of the almost 1.2 billion that's spent overseas by companies in Australia, there's only one project in a Latin American country. So my question is, and I think we'll get to the, I have a few ideas of what the answer might be, but my question is, why is that? Why isn't there more of that kind of collaboration, especially as we share a hemisphere? We're both in the southern hemisphere, we share a climate, we share many other things. Why is it that most of that R&D expenditure goes to the US or Europe or China when there's just as big a market in our hemisphere? I'll leave it at that for now.